Bang Forum. For those of you that are members of Bang and are here because you're members of Bang, we have our annual survey that is out. You received a link with the most recent newsletter. There's also a link on the slide, and I pasted it again also in the chat. So please, if you're a Bang participant, please take the few minutes to fill out that survey. We do use the survey responses to guide how we plan out the forums and the newsletter content for each year. We look back at the previous year surveys for forum topics and speakers and all of those types of things. So we're always looking for more speakers. So if you have suggestions for speakers, please put them in there. We are also always looking for more volunteers to be part of our Bang planning team. Also wanted to bring up that the Oregon Project Management Advisory Board is currently looking for a new board member. So if you are interested in being part of the Oregon Project Management Advisory Board, I will paste a link to their website into the chat as well, so that you can follow that link and gather any other information that you might be looking for and apply to be a board member if you so desire. So I'm putting that page in the chat. This is a joint forum, so we have Bang members and PMUG members represented in this forum. So at the end, I'll give you a little bit of information about the upcoming Bang and PMUG forums, when we're all going to be meeting next, and so forth. Okay, that's probably about all the business I needed to attend to. Oh yeah, and there's the link again for the OpMap. Put that in the chat as well for you if you're interested in becoming a board member with that group. And Bang and PMUG and the Agile Community of Practice are all part of the Oregon Project Management Advisory Board kind of family. We're all just one big family. And today we have Travis Miller. He is here partially from the Agile Community of Practice, also as his role as an ASCIO, Assistant State CIO for the Healthy People Policy area, going to be speaking to us, giving us an update on the EIS Agile Oversight Initiative, and I'm sure some information about the Agile Community of Practice that is now up and running. And hopefully you've all been able to take part in at least one of the events that they have hosted. Really valuable information there about what Agile project management is and how we're using it here in the state. But specifically today, how EIS is oversighting your Agile projects and how they plan to be moving forward. So don't want to read Travis's bio to you. You can read that on your own, but excited to have Travis back. Hopefully you all remember that Travis and a group of others presented about a year ago, I think, to the month, at least at Bang, but also presented at PMUG about the Agile Oversight Initiative that was going on at the time. So should be a good update for you all. And with that, Travis, I think you can go ahead and take the presentation, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate that. Let me know when you can see it.
Switch windows. It's loading. And for those of you participating today, if you've got questions or anything for Travis as he goes, please put them in the chat. And then I will speak up and let Travis know that he's got questions in there and he can address them at the proper moment during his presentation.
Yeah, thank you. And also just to say, I'm also joined by Alicia Miller. She's the Oversight Analyst for the Healthy People Policy area, so she can also field some questions. Unfortunately, Carolina was not able to join us today. She had some personal stuff going on. But with that, I'll go ahead and jump in. Just going to briefly kind of revisit the background, why Agile Oversight, why now, touch on the EIS strategic framework, talk a little bit about Agile Defined, Agile definitions more generally, and then briefly recap some of the main findings from our Agile environmental scan. I believe a year ago, I presented a full presentation on the survey and our literature review. I'm just going to hit the high points as we move through, and then really focusing on EIS Agile Oversight. what is changing? What are the core deliverables? What do we do in terms of pilots? And what does the rollout look like? And then finally touch on the Agile community of practice. And again, like Tim said, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll do my best to address them as we move through. So yeah, definitely want to be participatory. So as I shared last time, this was one of our key initiatives. So the objective being to mature project transparency and accountability, specifically accelerating the adoption of agile and iterative development approaches. There's a link to the strategic framework if you haven't seen it there. This initiative was captured in a charter. We had a one-pager out there for a bit, and in terms of the intent, it was really focused on identifying barriers that prevent or limit the adoption of Agile, clarifying oversight engagement, aligning with best practices, including tailoring, hopefully enabling acceleration of value delivery, and then alignment with our modernization playbook and vision for digital transformation. There's a few concurrent work streams that were happening. The first one was really that Agile scan. And again, I'll touch on that. Surveys, consulting engagements, as well as a portfolio assessment, everything that was in the portfolio at the time that we started the initiative, interviews, a lot of conversations. And then also we had several Agile pilots that happened. There was a stage gate assessment with some artifact mapping, and then also partnering with this group, the Project Management User Group, Oregon Project Management Advisory Board, in working to set up an Agile community of practice. And it looked like we had one question already. Maybe it was just an errant hand. I'll keep going. So why Agile? Why now? At this point, Agile is widely the default, at least in terms of standard, in terms of software development. It's widely used within the private sector, increasingly in the public sector as well. California, they kind of started this back in 2017. A lot of other states have gone this direction. Fortunately, we're able to leverage a lot of those learnings, both at the state and the federal level, as well as some private sector practices. And really, not just Agile software development or Agile project management, but Agile practices in terms of ways of working are really essential for modernization, digital transformation, new ways of working, and being much more adaptive. The other thing is we were already oversighting Agile projects. There were a number of agencies that were already using these methods, typically vendor-driven. And so we really needed to catch up our oversight engagement with the facts on the ground. I think we were actually surprised at how many Agile engagements were already in flight. And then in terms of aligning EIS oversight with Agile practices, putting in some guardrails, also giving credit for work that was already happening. If you have a well-groomed backlog and if you have a roadmap, do you also need a WBS if you're using Agile? So kind of questioning, do we need to replicate the work? Can we just use the Agile artifacts as the basis for our engagement and validating that you're using best practice? So trying to eliminate duplicative work, giving credit. And then also paying attention to the right things. So a lot of the focus is on artifacts, but there are also ceremonies that we weren't paying attention to. And so really identifying the core Agile artifacts that we should be evaluating, and then also getting some visibility into the ceremonies in terms of planning, demos, retrospectives that give us actual and real-time insight into the practices. And then finally, greater project transparency, ultimately reducing risk reduction and enabling us to identify red flags much earlier. So we have our myths slide. This was adapted from California's Understanding Agile, and we just added our own myth. And so none of these statements are true. I'm not going to go ahead and read these again, but I will touch on number 12, number 11 and number 12. So number 11, Agile will replace the stage gate oversight model. Agile practices, the EIS Agile oversight engagement is being embedded within the existing stage gate oversight model. We're essentially adapting it to accommodate Agile practices. The other thing is we are not prescribing Agile versus predictive. We're not prescribing a particular Agile methodology. We are not developing or creating an organ-specific Agile methodology. We're really looking to agencies to adopt the practices and the frameworks that make the most sense for the agency as well as the vendor that they're working with. So just want to dispel some myths. Happy to take on any of these other myths if you feel like challenging me or having an interesting conversation. In terms of Agile definitions, we are very much aligned with PMI. We've leveraged the PMI definition from the Agile Practice Guide as well as the one from Discipline Agile. None of this should be, that surprising or shocking, but really trying to align with industry best practice. If you hadn't heard, PMI also recently acquired the Agile Alliance, so we're likely to see a lot more Agile content being disseminated by PMI. So what did we learn? Spent a lot of time talking to agencies, surveying people. We learned that a lot of hybrid Agile is happening out there. That is pretty much the dominant approach. And in some cases, this is kind of the switch or the pivot from predictive to Agile. In other cases, it's a blending of methodologies. And also just to acknowledge that there are very few or rare instances in which you're going to see pure Agile in the state or in the public sector generally. There's always going to be some level of governance, some level of gating, at least in Oregon with the gating. Also, Scrum was by far the most common Agile methodology in use. And then this notion of pivots, most of the projects that are currently under oversight, most of the ones that we found in our portfolio assessment, it was a pretty typical pattern of a project starting out as predictive, going through the initial planning, and then after the solicitation, after putting out their RFP, the selection of an Agile vendor. And so some of the challenges that arise from that kind of stumbling into an Agile delivery is in some cases you didn't have Agile experience within the agency. Sometimes you didn't have a product owner. You might not have any defined ways of working or a particular framework within the agency. And so essentially you just have agencies in some cases adopting the framework, the practices, and the tooling that the vendor brings. In some cases, we had agencies, not naming names, who didn't even have access to the Agile tools that the vendor was using to manage the work, whether that's Jira or ADOS, particularly problematic. So some of the kind of common challenges, common barriers, ineffective product ownership came up again and again. That also shows up quite a bit in the literature. And there's this notion of product ownership being available, authoritative, and appropriate. Sometimes we had product owner with other duties as assigned. Sometimes we had unempowered product owners. And sometimes we had unqualified product owners, or no product owner at all. And again, that's a little bit Scrum specific, but that was one of the key challenges we saw again and again. Vendor relationships could be challenging. In some cases, you had vendors talking about being hybrid and using Agile, but then not engaging in common ceremonies or providing visibility into work being created or prioritizing the backlog in any kind of meaningful way. So this is something that our IQMS vendors kind of noted. Existing contracts currently can provide barriers or create barriers for Agile delivery, particularly when the statement of work has embedded a large number of predictive artifacts that come from our required artifacts form. So working to reconcile that tension and also working with DOJ as well as procurement to hopefully smooth that out a little bit. So existing contracts are definitely a challenge. And then also ineffective use of Agile tools and techniques hindering value delivery. In terms of by the numbers, we reviewed 30 plus sources, like I mentioned, federal, state, as well as a lot of consultant material. PMI has some good materials. We conducted 3 surveys. We had 545 responses, and that was from small agencies, medium size, across policy areas. In some cases, some of the private sector partners that we work with, particularly project managers who are on contract. So even procurement. I think DOJ might have even answered a survey. So a lot of feedback from the community. Hopefully, you all have had received those surveys and completed them, and then also a lot of consultations with our analysts, primarily Infotech and Gartner, reviewing the draft forms. In the case of Infotech, really kind of structuring our approach to this work through their blueprint around adopting a gating model to support agile delivery, which I'll briefly touch on, and then also workshops. We had some workshops internally within EIS that included P3, our partners, IQMS, ASCIOs, our PMO. So really trying to build some fluency in agile terminology and practices as we went through this work, and also trying to adopt agile ways of working in supporting the Agile initiative. These were just some of the main sources. The Agile Practice Guide from PMI in association with Agile Alliance 2017, fantastic resource. Obviously, you have version 7 of the PMBOK guide, increasingly adaptive, about half the content. Discipline Agile, Choose Your Wow, really great resource. Like I mentioned before, California, they rolled out their Agile Oversight model in 2017. Some really great material there. We actually leveraged their readiness assessment. So we used that in combination with some other materials for that deliverable. The GAO has an Agile assessment guide, about 300 pages. Everything more than you ever wanted to know about Agile, from Agile contracting to how you would assess it, how you would implement earned value management within the context of Agile. Some really great recommendations on best practices and pitfalls. And so really great stuff there. And then also Digital Services Playbook, really great resource. And then another one just to point out for folks, the State Software Budgeting Handbook. This one was put out by the General Services Administration, 18F, which may or may not exist anymore, but you can still find it. I have a copy. So some good materials. And then, like I mentioned, we did our surveys, and by and large, the number one barrier to Agile adoption was project governance and gating. Lack of Agile training was also pretty high up there, and then also this notion of how non-Agile teams work with Agile teams. Procurement also made the list. And then, like I mentioned before, in terms of Agile methodologies, Scrum was far and away the most common, followed by other, and Kanban not far behind. A little bit of discipline Agile out there. I know we have a couple of folks with some safe background, but not a lot of it in use. Like I mentioned, we used this Infotech blueprint, create an Agile-friendly project gating and governance approach, and it wasn't so much a set of answers or deliverables. It was really an approach to the work. So essentially kind of identify where those pain points are, do your artifact mapping, and then essentially leveraging some of these tools and templates to implement what they call trust but verify. And really, we took this notion of an incremental gate endorsement from this blueprint. So what did we come up with? So first of all, we changed our reviewed artifacts form. It is now the Agile-oriented reviewed artifacts form, and it's aligned with common Agile project artifacts, allowing for some hybrid variation or flexibility. We've also shifted the timing of artifact submission. And then really, instead of just a fixed and final artifact that is developed and submitted and forgotten, which is not the case for all artifacts, moving to an incremental artifact or living artifact so that the artifact will evolve. And I think the backlog is probably the best example of that. We're going to look at it throughout the project lifecycle. Also, this notion of an incremental endorsement for 3A and 3B, essentially setting agencies up for an initial delivery with validation. And the idea being that we can move them into execution earlier because we've put some guardrails around it. And then also trying to support the agile maturity of agencies, as well as helping them determine the most appropriate project lifecycle. So the agency agile maturity evaluation, this will determine the availability of that incremental endorsement. It's going to be a conversation between you and your oversight team. So more on that one. And then the project agile readiness evaluation is really focused on the nature of the project itself, the team involved, and what you're trying to accomplish. So, does this really lend itself to an agile approach? Is it more predictive, perhaps hybrid? So where there are kind of mismatches, how would you potentially mitigate some of those gaps? I'm not going to read this. This is really just up here for illustrative purposes. This is going to be posted online fairly shortly. I'm sure Tim can give you an update as he'll be the one posting it. So again, it's a new form. We've essentially left stage one largely unchanged, with the exception of the Agile project readiness evaluation, if you've determined that you're ready to take an Agile approach. That could happen after stage two, or it could happen even later. And then also essentially pairing up the traditional predictive artifact with the Agile equivalent. I know that this looks like a lot of artifacts. This is for a level 3 project, so much higher in terms of complexity and scale. And also, we're listing Agile artifacts multiple times because they'll be reviewed incrementally. Additionally, we have developed some internal guidance, or I guess some artifact guidance that will be appended to our project oversight guide for new artifacts. And we're providing definitions. What is this artifact? How does it support the practice? The definitions, be it PMI or from the GAO Agile Oversight Guide, recommended components, a checklist, and then any recommended resources. So trying to provide some additional context for what we're looking for and why. This is the kind of visual view of this incremental endorsement. And the idea, like I mentioned before, is an earlier incremental endorsement with validation. So we're looking at 8 sprints or 4 months. You would essentially determine or define what your initial release would be after executing the contract, after vendor onboarding. What can you do in 8 sprints or 4 months? And then coming back and validating that you're delivering value or successfully using agile practices. No questions on that one? Like I mentioned earlier, we have this agency agile maturity evaluation. This one definitely leaned on the materials from California. We added this crawl, walk, run, and then amended some of the questions based on the materials from Gartner and Infotech. It's 24 questions, 5-point Likert scale. This was sent out, I think, to agency IT directors about 2 weeks ago. In the healthy people policy area, I think we've got maybe 30 or 40% of these already completed. Not sure where the other policy areas are at. But really, you've got 6 categories: culture, experience, environment and technology, organizational flexibility, training assistance, commitment to user research. Really, this is supposed to both assess your current maturity as well as guide you in how to increase your maturity over time. The other kind of recurring theme in this one is, obviously training, certification, experience, but product ownership. That's just such an important aspect of this. And then also we have that project Agile readiness evaluation. Again, Gartner, PMI, also the Agile practice guide. We took their suitability filter and essentially modified it a little bit, essentially shifting from a 10-point scale to a 5-point scale, and then incorporating some questions from Gartner that were particularly on point. And then this one is really looking at culture, team, and project. So, who is the team that's going to be working on this? Who are the stakeholders that are invested or supporting this project? What is their level of flexibility? Are you dealing with regulated data? Are you dealing with fixed timelines? Do you have to deliver the full solution at once, or does it lend itself to incremental delivery? So things to think through in terms of your project approach and whether Agile is appropriate or to what extent. Again, this is going to be posted on the forms and templates page of the P3 or the EIS website under P3. Like I mentioned, we had several projects that we piloted these new artifacts with, 2 of them in healthy people. Provider enrollment, case management, they were further along in their journey. So essentially they were all the way coming up towards their stage gate 3 endorsement. So we used the new required artifacts form as well as Agile friendly stage gate conditions, and we're continuing to partner with them. They will continue to operate under that original memo, the pilot memo with those conditions. Natural resources, we would like to continue to partner with them and give them the option to continue moving forward. They had to go back out for RFP, so we didn't actually get the chance to do the stage gate 3 endorsement and update their required reviewed artifacts form. And then DOC, we're still just kind of in initiation. So at this point, we've essentially gone live with the Agile Oversight. Like I mentioned before, we had our planned rollout. We had our soft launch. We've got a little piece in the EIS Digest. We've updated. Yeah. Okay. Pilots are going to continue. Like I mentioned before, they're going to continue under the conditions that they were approved under. And then also we have the maturity evaluation that is live. Agencies have submitted or are working to submit those. And then for new projects, projects that are initiated going forward, we're going to do the Agile readiness evaluation. Once we determine whether Agile is, a viable path for them, end of stage 1, stage 2, wherever they're at, the Agile-oriented reviewed artifacts form, and then the incremental gating for those who have the appropriate Agile maturity, and we're going to continue to support the Agile community of practice. In terms of expected outcomes, really hoping that we can better prepare agencies to engage with an Agile vendor or to take an Agile approach, be that with internal resources or with a platform or something. Really hoping that we can identify issues and challenges much earlier in the project rather than at UAT or after we've blown through our schedule or budget. And I think one thing is that there's accountability on both sides, particularly when you're entering into an Agile vendor relationship, because essentially the agency needs to be ready to move and to be able to make decisions and keep up with a vendor. And at the same time, we have to ensure that the vendors are using actual best practice, they're providing transparency, that they're actually delivering value. So holding both sides accountable. And then visibility, being able to see what's happening, getting insight in terms of the ceremonies as well as what's actually being delivered. And then, like I mentioned before, aligning our oversight processes, the reviewed artifacts form with Agile practices. Additionally, improving maturity over time. By assessing our maturity now and continuing to focus on that maturity and what it takes to improve that maturity over time, we hope to see agencies continue to invest in their Agile capabilities and then be ready to move. So a couple of quick words on the Agile community of practice. We had a charter. We co-signed or co-sponsored this initiative between EIS, Enterprise Information Services, as well as the Oregon Project Management Advisory Board, really focused on training, creating a resource library, shared learning. We also used it to get feedback on the deliverables to support the Agile Oversight Initiative, and community. So we've got our website, our LinkedIn page. We just sent out our second newsletter. Like Tim mentioned, we've had several events. We had an event with Gartner on human-centered design. We had a workshop with Anthrotech. They're a human design consultancy based in Washington. A really great event. We're looking at bringing Gartner back. We also have a partnership with Innovate US. And so we have a variety of courses that are available for free, including a human-centered design course. They've also had several workshops recently on shifting to a product model in government. And we're actually going to be having our first co-sponsored event with Innovate US, focused on the book Power to the Public, that looked at kind of public interest technology as a field, and specifically with a focus on data design and delivery really kind of embracing Agile practices as well as design thinking. So you can follow the link. They have a number of courses, self-paced courses where you can earn a certificate. And then typically once or twice a week, they have a variety of workshops. Some of them, kind of Agile focused, some of them a little bit more human-centered design focused, and some of them on just kind of innovation mindset, various other skills, stakeholder management, things like that. And then also we built a resource library. We have some Agile training that we have pulled together from federal sources, a variety of white papers, various tools. We're hoping to continue to expand this over time. The two training paths that we have, both of those were from 18F and digital.gov. One of them is a 6-module course on Agile, 3 modules. The first one's like a Agile 101, followed by Scrum 101, and then Kanban. The public sector digital leadership learning path, that essentially takes an 18F training that's very closely aligned with the de-risking guide that they developed, and essentially walks through Agile management, software development, human-centered design, and then goes into Agile contracting. So really good stuff there. Hoping to continue to expand that. Really, that's pretty much it. So I'll stop sharing unless anyone needs me to go back to a particular page. Also, just to say, it's been a year and a half getting to this point, but really this is the start. It's going to take a long time for agencies to kind of get up to speed with Agile practices, embark on Agile projects, just given the nature of our funding and project cycles. There's a lot of projects that are in flight today where you're not going to necessarily pivot, but over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, I think we'll see a lot more shift towards Agile delivery. That's my hope, at least.
Yeah, thank you, Travis. I don't see any questions in the chat, so sorry about that. If anybody had some questions at this point, I think you could just simply raise your hand and we'll let you unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah.
There's one. Go ahead, unmute yourself, Jennifer.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I had a question when it comes to what you're viewing StageGate to be. How is StageGate going to be different for Agile in in terms of paperwork compared to how StageGate currently is for a waterfall project? Do you think it's going to be a quicker process, or is there going to be more iterations required?
So I think we're not going to have constant iterations. I think the iterations are going to be at each gate endorsement. And I think there will still be documentation. That's not going away. But focusing on the right documentation and also just-in-time planning. So instead of like expecting a full work breakdown structure with a detailed schedule and all the tasks laid out for 2 years, like what is your roadmap? What are you doing for the next 3, 4, or 5 sprints? What is the epic? So it's the level of detail, the expectations for the level of detail at the point in time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would add on to that too is that if you take a look at the artifacts form once it's published, you're going to see a like in kind difference between the waterfall or the more predictive artifacts that we would traditionally ask for and their accompanying Agile specific artifact. And so the goal is not to just overwhelm you with more documentation because that's not always the thing that indicates success, but it's making sure that there's the visibility in the right type of documentation and the transparency for your project. Because what we don't want to do, and I think what we've realized has been occurring, is that the projects that are more agile, our artifacts form does not really lend for agile artifacts, nor do our contracts do. So it doesn't really give us or you, if they're not or artifacts that you are requesting of your vendor, the transparency that's necessary for you to actually see the vendor is performing and they're delivering and it's of quality and you have that confidence in the success at whatever, incremental go live or the uniform go live that most projects have. So the goal is to really align the transparency with what the vendor is supposed to be delivering with the methodology that they have promised to use, and making sure that the state overall has the visibility and transparency to hold them accountable and that you have more control over your project.
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, Jennifer.
I had one follow-up question from that. So, is there a particular methodology of Agile that is expected to be used, or is this able to be applied to different methodologies?
Yeah, we've really tried everything there it is a little bit Scrum agnostic because that is the most common. That said, or Scrum oriented. That said, you're free to use any methodology, whether that is Scrum, Kanban, Safe, DevOps. We'll see. Not sure if we're all ready for that. So it's really supposed to be framework agnostic.
And I think that when you're working with your SIPM and your oversight analyst, as you start to further define what approach or methodology you're going to be using, that's where we're going to want to make sure that we have a good understanding of what your approach is going to be, and what your expectations are, what your capabilities are, and how can we come alongside you in an oversight model that kind of helps tailor so that we're all looking at the right things and we're not trying to, force a square into a round hole necessarily. But, the goal is to just have a better understanding of what you're trying to accomplish and how you're trying to get there, and just making sure there's that transparency and visibility behind it.
So there's a quick question in the chat. Are we standardizing Agile on Agile tools? No, not at this time. We see a lot of Jira, we see a lot of Azure DevOps or ADOS, ADO. But agile tooling is something that needs to be thought about up front. And ideally, it's your tool. And if the vendor is bringing that tool, you need to make sure that you have access. We have some agencies where they literally can't have access to the user stories or the backlog. And that puts the state at risk and doesn't give yourself or our office any visibility into what's actually happening. So agile tooling is definitely an issue that we want to be thinking about. And I know that there's some challenges right now with ADOS not being available in a government cloud environment. So I know that ODHS OHA has been using an on-prem version of ADOS to kind of mitigate that. So this is a known challenge, but we do not have a service offering right now for a standard agile environment. But you definitely want to go into it thinking about how are we going to engage with the vendor, what are the rights, and what tool. Is it Rum?
Rum, go by Rum. Yeah. I I work at Oregon State Lottery. So you mentioned about the standard that that right now there's really not, I guess, standardization in a way, but it's good to have a framework in those. So my question is, when various teams that have projects, could be IT managed or could be business teams. And of course, with so many different way of doing projects, how do you, I guess, what's the best way to, kind of without standards and things like that, standardization. So, it's like for projects, how would each team know which method to use and trying to get agreement, small project versus large project, and then IT project versus enterprise projects and those?
So I think it is definitely in the interest of agencies to have a standardized approach and methodology within their agency. And so, in some of the larger agencies, that certainly is the case, where they have common artifacts, common reporting requirements, status reports, things like that. I just, from an EIS perspective, we don't want to set that standard for all agencies because agencies have their own PMOs, standards, and experience. So it is problematic when you have different divisions or work units using different methodologies. I think it's possible to reconcile those, but in general, it's easier to have an agency-wide methodology if possible.
Yeah, agency is a little bit wider, but I guess as for like, let's say small team at Lorry, right, running different projects, we're just trying to see, what's the best way to make sure they don't, like, let's say you have a new PM comes in, then they might be have a different idea running things, doing things, whether it's PM from the business team different than PM from IT teams. We're trying to align so we don't kind of end up in the same result, right? Same goal, not like those type of things. I guess we just kind of, I don't want to create any confusion here. Just does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and this does come up, especially when you have business-led projects that are being run outside of the PMO.
Yeah.
It can be challenging. I think it really comes down to like culture and setting team agreements and agreeing on ways of working.
Yeah.
There's not an easy answer to that one, and it's pretty context specific.
Okay. No, I'm just looking for different, way up to improve because, because sometimes it takes time when we don't have the same goals, right? And then you end up with just spending more resources in those types. Okay. Right.
Well, I think this also comes up a lot when you bring in outside PMs or outside BAs. It can take a long time to get them up to speed, not only with the agency practices, but in some cases having to engage with EIS and DOJ and procurement because that's just not part of their typical practice. So this is a recurring pain point.
Okay, right.
Especially when one
Appreciate that.
side's very predictive.
Thank you.
Yeah. Question in the chat: are there any materials that can be shared to handle technical debt in Agile projects? I mean, at this point, the materials that we've gathered are, kind of the oversight deliverables and really kind of information on Agile practices, some, kind of training materials, basic guidance. Yeah, addressing technical debt. Hopefully you're not creating new technical debt. And that's where you could get into like a quality surveillance kind of model. This is something that GSA talks about, is like, as you're building new code, you're also assessing it for its complexity and whether you can sustain it. So hopefully whatever you're building is where you want to go in terms of your architecture or aligned with what you already have.
Thank you.
Question on, would you encourage us to carry these principles into contract renewal language? Alicia, I'll let you take that one.
My bread and butter. If folks don't know, I have an extensive history in IT procurement. So if the only part about renewals that this might not actually work very well with is that you have to have obviously you have to have an agreement with your vendor. And if this is not something that has been traditionally imposed, or if there's not a large issue with the relationship that would lend itself for them wanting to kind of bridge that gap and whatever that issue might be, then you might not have the leverage necessary to really get them to want to adopt these principles or hold themselves accountable to these principles through a renewal process. There's a lot more leverage during the contract negotiation of a brand new contract that's potentially worth millions and millions of dollars. And this is where really trying to incorporate a lot of the things that we're talking about with the Agile artifacts or the processes and the principles at the RFP stage, and kind of either setting the stage or setting the stage with what you know that you aren't able to support. And that's where that project Agile readiness assessment would be a really great kind of value point to do ahead of your RFP, is to better understand what can you support, what can you not support. But as far as the renewal, unfortunately, unless you have a very open vendor who wants to continue a long-standing relationship, or you have severe issues the vendor is willing to basically bow down to you to fix, we don't have a whole lot of leverage to get them to agree to these things, and it has to be a mutual agreement. So we lose leverage during the renewal process. Sorry, that's a very long-winded, very excited response. I apologize, but
no, that's really good, Alicia, and I agree with everything Alicia said. It's all accurate, and there's limits to your leverage and how much you can kind of shift an existing agreement or support for a product that's already in production. Just personally, I would say if there's an opportunity to shift more towards a DevOps continuous integration model with more frequent releases, I would encourage that. If you're ready. At this point, no, we do not have any guidance on RFP development or SOWs. I think we're working on identifying good examples, though. And this is so we're not really in a position to speak on behalf of procurement. And while we are ready to partner and can certainly be available to answer questions of how they might think about structuring for Agile delivery, we're not in a position to publish guidance on that. However, I do have some federal resources on how to think about structuring procurement approaches for agile delivery. Tim.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe just to follow up to the question you just addressed in the chat is I'm also thinking about that in terms of what you mentioned with tools that you might use for project management, right? Of course, if you want maybe to be thinking about that in the agreement, what tools you're going to bring to the table, what tools the vendor's going to bring to the table. Like you said, you don't want to end up in a situation where, oh, it turns out we don't have insight into the vendor's tools, or there are barriers to getting the vendor into our tools, whether it means bringing them into our Jira environment or something. And then, okay, and now we have to pay for licenses for them and think about how we set up those roles and everything. And if we can think about that, of course, at those earlier stages, that would be great.
Yeah, no, I think tools and whatever framework or methodology that you have experience in within the agency, I think telegraphing that or making that part of negotiations will better position the agency, because otherwise they're just gonna decide for you.
Mm-hmm. So just generally, I guess your general guidance then is just yes, think about it. Then yes, try to incorporate it into your agreement as much as possible, and come to an agreement before you get started.
Absolutely.
Well, and hold the vendor accountable to that, because there are a number of projects across the portfolio where there was a set expectation about the tool and the access to the tool and the way that it would be set up. And then concessions get made during planning because people, planning with your vendor because people are excited to get going and they're chomping at the bit. And then, you don't find out until a year or two into the project that you're not quite certain what's been done or what hasn't been done, because the tooling and the access and the transparency just isn't there. So it can still be written down, but the act of actually holding them accountable and using those escalation measures at your disposal and not being afraid to might make or break, the confidence that you have in the product that you've purchased at a critical juncture like, UAT.
I hear that. That's good advice. I'm thinking about some experiences we've had recently and how we can avoid that in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, no. Jack, I see your question in there, an unmanaged backlog, tools to hold the vendor accountable. I think, so everything that we've read basically talks about the criticality of the product owner and the fact that you cannot outsource product ownership. The vendor cannot be your product owner. And while we don't have contracts saying that the vendor is the contract owner, they, in some cases, become the de facto product owner because there's no one on the agency side. And if you're not prioritizing the backlog, if you're not working towards a minimum viable product, and the vendor is just kind of coding ad hoc and delivering features based on whatever they feel like delivering, that's not a place that you want to be. Like, I think part of the challenge with moving towards agile delivery is that you have shared accountability with the vendor. You don't just say, build the thing, and then come back 2 years later and expect to see the thing. You are actively building the thing with them by prioritizing the work and determining whether what they've delivered is sufficient or not. And so it's more work, it's more engagement, it's much more collaborative, and it's not a contract for a thing, it's a contract for a relationship. And so,
can I add to my question real quick?
Please. Yeah.
Thank you. So, there were these questions about the RFP and the contracting, and to me that seems like a bit of a central piece. We can talk about shared ownership and holding a vendor accountable till the pigs fly, but at the end of the day, this is work. We're asking for work to be done, and the vendor is trying to make a profit, arguably, so they're not just going to be doing free work. and doing iterations on and on. So while I do appreciate the Agile oversight model, I think there's a lot of additional work that needs to happen for this to be able to be put in practice.
I don't disagree. This is the start of a very long journey. Jennifer.
For some of the stage gate projects, it requires certain qualifications or position determination. Will there be such a requirement for this Agile EIS stage gate?
We have not developed a matrix to support different complexity levels at this time. And I think it's a little bit more
Specific to Agile projects.
specific to Agile. I think it's a little bit more challenging in this space because there are so many certifications and frameworks. It would be hard to map them. It's not impossible, but we've not yet done that. And so I'll leave it there. I think the other thing is, to some extent, with version 7, well, all the way back with version 6, version 7 of the PMUG, you're starting to see the expectation that project managers, project leaders are familiar with various lifestyles or project life cycles. And so I think increasingly there will be an expectation for project managers to be experienced in Agile delivery or adaptive delivery, if we're using the PMI to speak.
I think the thing that we are currently using, which could potentially inform some future complexity assessment for Agile-centric projects, would be that project, the Agile readiness assessment for the project specifically. And that to us would be important for the agency to use to understand where their strengths and weaknesses are, where they have incurred risk that they want to mitigate, or where it just they see the results and then they decide absolutely not, we're not ready, or 100% we are ready. And I think that's more of an introspective tool that the agency could use to identify whether or not they have the right resources in place to run an Agile project, and maybe what the complexity with the makeup of their resources is to support an Agile project. But I don't think from an oversight perspective, we try to keep our assessment tools pretty simple, because the nuances to projects already create more complexity, and we don't really want our artifacts or our model to become even more convoluted and complex as well.
I think the other thing is that really with Agile delivery, you're moving from like individual accountability, project manager responsible for all things, to a model of team accountability. And for Agile to work, you really need that executive buy-in from leadership, an effective an effective sponsor, an effective product owner, and an empowered team that can work together. So I think there's a cultural aspect to this, which is part of those assessments, but it's one person with a certification in an environment that is hostile to Agile isn't going to work. And so that's why you have to focus on kind of the culture, the leadership, the team, the individual, and the nature of the project itself. Because if those things all aren't in place, it doesn't matter who your Scrum Master is. It doesn't matter if you bring in Agile coaches. If you have a culture and a project that is antithetical to Agile practices or the Agile mindset, it doesn't matter. And honestly, this project isn't unique to Agile. I mean, we have plenty of examples of challenges in terms of sponsorship with predictive approaches or disengaged sponsorship. So I think that shift from individual to team lessens the need for that certification designation based on complexity, because it's really the organization. Is the organization ready for Agile?
Thank you. I like that reframing about the organization being ready versus the individual.
And honestly, this is a much bigger shift for the business side of the house, because they have to be actively engaged in a way that they haven't had to with predictive projects. And so that's where I think the biggest challenge and shift is going to be culturally. They want the speed, they want the flexibility, but they have to show up and they have to make decisions. Some real talk there.
I agree.
Yeah, Tim, I don't know if I don't know if I
Aaron
have
Johnson
any.
is very aware that there needs to be updates made to the contracting documents that are DOJ approved. And she's all down for some work sessions, but we just have to, follow some
I think Alicia has more influence
processes.
than I do.
I do tell her that I want to take her away for a weekend and lock her in a house, and we can't leave until it's done. So
Please
that
do.
brings you any level of confidence, Tim. We're trying.
Tim.
Maybe this is an obvious question, and maybe you said it at the beginning, and I came in a little bit late. But I'm guessing the place, is there only one starting point for like if you don't have a pilot in Agile, and maybe you have projects that are already in some flavor resembling some kind of Agile adjacent methodology, but I guess what I'm asking is, what's the best intake point? Is it really best to consider the new artifacts and the new guidance for upcoming projects and just start talking with our SIPM about those and whether or not they're good candidates for a more Agile approach
I
to
think
oversight?
I think in general you want to be focusing on new projects, but I'm going to answer a different question, and that's, I think there's opportunities to start getting experience with Agile practices, even with small initiatives that do not require oversight, even within the context of operations, even like Kanban. Like Kanban is something that can be directly applied to your daily operations today, whether it's in program or within the back office function. Um, so I think identifying opportunities to build those kind of agile muscles and kind of shift ways of working, moving towards more transparent, kind of open methods, um, that you don't have to wait for an IT project for that to happen.
And I would say too, just in the healthy people policy area, so I can't speak to other policy areas, but our SIPM and I and Travis too, because it's still such a new initiative, we are really working together that if a project has been initiated, they've gone through planning, they've selected a vendor that is, going to do an agile approach. If they had a artifact form that was issued under the, older, strictly waterfall predictive artifacts, if that's no longer going to serve their purpose, we would like an opportunity to work with the project to figure out, if that does not make sense for you, then maybe we reissue the new artifact form that does align with the agile approach. And one thing that I would say too is, leverage that contracting relationship that you're going to be entering into with your vendor. Don't reproduce artifacts. If you know you're going to have to provide sprint completion reports to EIS to fulfill oversight obligations, that should be a deliverable with the level of detail necessary to satisfy oversight requirements, because we're already paying them to do that work. So let's not pay them to do that work and then submit it to EIS and then us say, well, what about X, Y, and Z? That's completely missing, because then the expectation is that the project team is going to have to true up that information to satisfy oversight. Bring us in as you are doing that negotiation process so that we can have a seat at the table to support you in requiring your vendor to do the heavy lift on a lot of your oversight obligations. That might be a way too, Tim, that we can kind of have some real-time changes to some of that contracting stuff that is stuck in that predictive way, just from a template level. And as we continue to move the needle on making those statements of work and even some of the T's and C's in that base contract more agile friendly, we would have live examples to provide to DOJ in real time as they have to provide legal sufficiency approval of those contracting documents for you to execute anyways. So I think there's multi-facets in how we can come alongside you if you realize that you really have a more agile-centric project. Are the things that we're going to ask you to do bringing value to your project, or are they no longer aligned with the methodology of your project? How can we true that up, and then how can we push the needle on some of these other things from a contracting or DOJ perspective that we have to work in tandem with them to get them to buy into all of this anyway. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I know this is a bank forum, but were the PMUG people also invited to this, or did they get another presentation? Okay.
Joint forum.
Great.
Any last questions? Otherwise, we might just get a little bit of time back this afternoon. All right, just a couple of final slides and thoughts from Bang and PMUG. Here we go. One more shameless plug for the Bang survey for those of you that are part of the Bang group. Please take a couple of minutes and fill out that survey for us. We'll close it in a couple of weeks, and we'll send out an email reminder before we close the survey. Please take a couple of minutes and get in there and fill that out for us. Bang is currently working on planning our April forum. We just had a meeting last week with a couple of members from Anthrotech, and so we're hoping that we can get them to come to our April forum and give us a great presentation on something BA related. We've got a couple of topics kind of up in the air with them for that. So I think we have Travis and the Agile Community of Practice to thank for that connection with Anthrotech. So we're going to start leveraging that as soon as we possibly can, probably in April. On the PMUG side, the next session for PMUG is March 19th, and it's going to be telling stories with data from Michael Mativa, and he's from Department of Revenue. That'll be a virtual session as usual. If you have any questions about the PMUG session, Amy Croucher's email is right there on the slide for you, so go ahead and give her a message if you've got questions about that. Bang and PMUG both have our web pages that hopefully you're already familiar with if you're part of these groups. And then the Bang email, if you have questions about Bang, is pretty easy, ba.network. And I believe the @oregon.gov still works. That is it for us today for this joint Bang PMUG forum. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Travis and Alicia, for the awesome information about Agile and for the really good question and answer session and discussion that we had after Travis's presentation. Thank you all for your contributions to that, and everybody have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.